one of the great Greek historians in the 4th century BC said that the Scythians, along with the Celts, were one of the 4 great peoples of the world, the Libyans and Indians and so on. But Celts we all know about. Scythians, very few people have heard of, except that recently there was a very good exhibition in the British Museum. So knowledge of the Scythians is coming out a bit. So let's start with where and when. That's probably the easiest thing. Where they lived largely on the steppe. We'll see the steppe on a map in a moment, but here is the steppe. This is grassland, incredible open grassland that runs as a great swathe from Mongolia, or Manchuria in fact, through Mongolia right across Asia into the Great Hungarian Plain, this great swathe of grassland. And people who write about it say that, who've written about it in the past, say that really, and you can see this in this picture, once you get into this landscape, it is a landscape that makes you want to move. It's a landscape of movement. You go there and you want to move and move and move and move. You don't settle and put down your roots. And I took this photograph in Mongolia, in fact, when we were just, I said I wanted to ride across the steppe, so we did a bit. And on a horse there, in that landscape, you just do want to move. You want to go down and find out what's in there. You want to go over that hill. You want to go and look at those hills. And this is a characteristic of the people that I'm talking about, the Scythians. They were always on the move. And what made it possible for them was, of course, the horse. The natural environment, the steppe is the natural environment for horses. These are wild horses in Mongolia. Horses, these are Przewalski's horses, but they are as close to the wild kind as possible. And in this great steppe environment, people domesticated the horse and were able to ride the horse from the 4th millennium onwards. So that you have this open landscape and you have people on horseback and the sense of movement is always there. Now, there is the steppe. It's possibly not easy to make out this map, but here is China. There's a bit of India down there, the Arabian Desert, a bit of the Mediterranean there with Italy up there. So you can see it's right across Eurasia. And the steppe is the green bit, the dark green bit, from Manchuria through Mongolia into the Altai Cyan mountains, more about those in a moment, right across the Kazakh steppe into the Caspian Pontic steppe, the steppe around the Black Sea, and then that last little bit over there in the Great Hungarian Plain. So it's a natural swathe of grassland. Two things about it that I think are significant. Some people say, you know, it's huge. Well, it is. But if you got on your horse in the Great Hungarian Plain, let's say at the very beginning of spring, and you went at a normal rate eastwards, you could end up in Mongolia before the winter set in. So you can move quickly across that landscape. There's nothing in the way, just a few river valleys, and nothing in the way. Oh, and these mountains here, which are a little bit difficult to get through. But the mountains are important, as we'll see. Now, the other thing about the steppe is what's called the steppe gradient. Essentially, it's westerly weather coming across the Atlantic, constantly coming across the Atlantic and bringing moisture, and going through Europe and gradually dropping its moisture. But as these air streams move east, they become less moist and less warm. So that the steppe in the Great Hungarian Plain and the Pontic steppe is good, moist steppe. The temperatures are moderate. As you get further and further and further east, it gets drier and colder. And in Mongolia in particular, it is very dry and very cold. So there is a tendency always to, if you're moving, is to move west. The grass is always greener in the west. So consequently, you get this flow of people over thousands, 1,500, 2,000 years perhaps, flow of people from the east to the west. and they nearly always end up in the Great Hungarian Plain, the last edge of the steppe. They need to stay in their environment. So that's where, when we're really talking about the first millennium BC. So let's start with, go back one to the map. We're going to start up here in the Altai Mountains, the Scythian Mountains and the Altai Mountains. This is southern Siberia now. The steppe gets broken up a bit there by the mountain ranges. So you get a lot of sort of valley systems with wonderful steppe and then surrounded by mountains. So the steppe is there, but it's less easy to move through. And it's probably in that area that these sort of predatory nomads, of whom the Scythians are one, the predatory nomads really started. And if we go back to, this is the Scythian Altai area, the Minusink Basin, this is southern Russia. It's one of these basins. You can see the green is where the steppe is, and then you've got mountains around. It's a typical basin with, these things are burial mounds of this nomad period. So you can see how they concentrate in the river valleys and where the pastures are lush. And it's probably in this sort of area, and there are many of these enclaves in the mountains and into Kazakhstan. It's in this area that these nomads really get started, and predatory nomads get started. And what may have started things off is a change in temperature and climate, somewhere about 9000 BC. We can see this in various bog sediments and tree ring analysis and so on, that it becomes much warmer and much moister, somewhere about 9000 BC. It's one of these cyclical things in temperature and climate change. And what happens is that this encourages population growth, and it frees up time. So you get lots of things working here. With an increased population, you get more pressure on land and a greater development of social hierarchies. And with more time, what you find is that the young men, essentially it is the young men in this area anyway, the young men have more time to go out and raid their neighbours. So you get a more aggressive raiding society developing. This is the archaeology of it. We call it the Tega, or Karusik Tega culture. It doesn't really matter, it's just a name. But a number of burial mounds, and these are the weapons which the warriors, the nomads, use. The typical weapons, the arrowheads, arrows very important as we'll see, the short swords, here's one of them with little animal heads on it. Animal art is very, very important here. And the battle axes, these vicious things. Here's one. Imagine this on a long handle, and you on horseback. It's a pretty effective weapon, that against your enemy. And again, little animals sort of enlivening it. So the archaeology of aggression, if you like. And it's from this sort of area, with these hierarchies appearing, and warrior bands going up further and further raiding, that this whole momentum of movement from the east to the west really begins. And we can see the archaeology of hierarchy very well. This is in one of the nearby valleys, not that one we looked at, a place called Arzhan, again southern Russia, where there is a huge, very rich, was very rich burial. This is a plan of a burial mound with a central burial chamber and then timbers making up little compartments. I did have a figure here. There are, yes, 6,000 trees were cut down to build this mound. It's a very big one. It's 50 meters across. And in the center there, here, was the burial chamber. It was dug into and the burials disturbed and all the objects taken away at some stage, leaving only this one, this lovely piece of animal art gold, a feline, possibly a snow leopard, bent back on itself in a way that is so characteristic of the nomad art. And the chieftain and his female partner were buried there. His horses were buried here, and all his retainers, his slaves and staff and so on, were killed at the same time as he was buried, and buried in these tombs all around. So here is power. And also his lineage, his family, had the power to use people to build this great monument. And then another element of the power is, you see in some of these compartments, there are little horses, symbols. What they found was that when they excavated, there's something like 150 horses and horse gear had been brought in and buried in and around the mound. And when they did an analysis of the equipment that the horses had with them, many of them had come from many, many kilometers away. In other words, these were horses decked out in quite finery, brought in and buried. So it shows that this particular person had power over very, very large territory. And his burial was a time that brought people together. So these are the sorts of people who were emerging. This dates to the 9th century, somewhere just about 800, in fact, BC. And then nearby is Arjan II, which was an archaeological delight. You can see it's being excavated there by a sort of Russian team, Russian-German team. And it's a delight because the central burial wasn't disturbed. And here you get the chieftain and his female partner absolutely covered in gold. Amazing amount of gold. Their weapons are covered in gold. All their clothes are covered in little, sort of almost thumbnail-size animals that are sewn on. And I was actually in St. Petersburg Museum talking to the guy who'd excavated this in a typical museum office, piled high with books, hardly any space to put papers down, battered old filing cabinets around. And I was asking him whether these were stamped or whether they were individually made or how they were done. He said, well, would you like to see them? I said, yes. And I imagined, we were going off to a vault somewhere with armed guards, and I had to put on protective clothing and so on. He went over to this battered old filing cabinet, opened a drawer, took out a box, took the lid off, and there they were. All these wonderful little, and we spent hours just handling these, no gloves, anything like that, just looking at these little things. But anyway, that's just one of the delights of being an archaeologist. So you see very, very rich burials. Now, we were looking up there in the Altai Scythian mountains, and the Scythians or Scythian-like peoples spread from there right the way across, and we know various names that they are known by from the classical, from Persian and from Greek sources. They had all kinds of different names, but one Greek source says the Persians call them Saka, but they're the same as our Scythians. We call them Scythians. So in effect, you get a lot of different tribal names across the steppe. And they were all slightly different, but all sharing this same predatory, horsey culture. The ones we know about, well, with Saka we know because they came into contact with the Persians, and here we see some of them from Persepolis, one of the Persian capital. These are Scythians wearing pointy helmets and taking offerings to the Persian king, Cyrus in this case. This one, they're taking horses, gold armlets, and horse blankets, the sorts of things that you would expect these warrior nomads to take as presents to the king. So we know about them from Persians, and we know about them too from the Greeks, because a number of these Scythians settled around the Black Sea, and the Greeks had colonies all the way around the Black Sea. So in that way, we have knowledge of them and some of their names. One of the groups we know in detail about, they settled in the North Caucasus. This is Chechnya and Ossetia, that sort of area now, southern Russian Federation still. And they built their tombs, and then they did what all good warrior horsemen do, they raid. They find somewhere to raid. Where better than in Asia Minor, where the Assyrians were being beaten up by the Urartians. There's a big war going on here. So from their settlements, they would go out and take part in that war, sometimes on one side, sometimes on the other side. They picked up, probably actual people, they picked up craftsmen, and those craftsmen from this area, Armenia, Georgia, that sort of area, made weapons, gold-cased daggers here, with Urartian art on them. So they were using craftsmen in their own art. Some of these journeys may have taken a very short time. Over when the summer starts, you think it's a good time to go off raiding, so you go through the Caucasus and have a good time and get some loot and so on, and then go back. But some took much longer, and Herodotus talks about one load who were there 20 years. They came through and they were 20 years taking part in the war here. So all the young men from this particular group left, and leaving their wives and their very small children and their slaves. And the men went away, and 20 years later, the men decided to go back. When they got back, the young men who were now there, who were the children of the wives and the slaves, decided they didn't want them back. And there was a big battle took place, and that's often depicted on Scythian art, this battle between the old men and the young men. And I'm pleased to say the old men won. It's these stories that come to us through the classical sources that enable us to sort of begin to understand what life among these peoples was like. The ones we know most about are the ones who are properly called Scythians, who settled north of the Black Sea in the Pontic steppe. There's the Crimea. Most of that's Ukraine and that's Russia now. Not quite sure where the border now is, but there were various groups of them, and the different colours there just represent slightly different cultural groups. So although we use the word Scythian for the whole lot, there were different sorts of Scythians. Some of them were actually growing grain, some were not, and they have slightly different artistic motifs and so on. But that's just an archaeological nicety. Essentially, all those were Scythians. And remember, the Greeks had settlements all the way around here. Olbia, which is not shown, but it's there, was one of the main Greek settlements. And there was a Chersonesos down here, and Crimea, and Panticapaeum up here on the Sea of Azov. And these were trading ports, so that the Greeks could interface with the Scythians. They could trade with them. And they did so perfectly amicably over, certainly from the 8th, 7th centuries on to the 4th, 3rd centuries. So there were good relationships. And what was happening was the Scythians were producing, or some of them were producing grain, which Greece needed. They were producing slaves, which Greece absorbed in large quantities, and furs and things like that, stuff coming out of the woodlands, the forests. And the Greeks were sending back consumer durables and wine and things of that kind. We find Greek wine amphorae. So there was a regular trade and interaction. And from that, we get this wonderful Pontic steppe art, which is Greek-inspired. And we get the stories of people like Herodotus, the father of history, so-called, who actually did go to Olbia and observed the Scythians and picked up stories and writes about them. So we've got lots of very good evidence. And all these green blobs are the burial sites, most of which have been dug, which have produced a whole range of archaeological evidence. So let's start looking at a Scythian. These are Scythians as they are depicted. They are horse riders. They wear baggy trousers, as all good horse riders should. They have these sort of pleated warm coats, long coats. They almost invariably have long hair and beards, and they are usually depicted in some way in relation to their horses. The human-horse interaction is crucial. Some of them, this one here is hunting hares. We know about this from, again, Herodotus talking about this. This one hobbling his horse, this one teaching the horse to lie down, to settle. But wonderful depictions of real people and constantly repeating the same motifs, the same clothes, the same hair, and this human-horse interaction. One of the main weapons that the Scythians were particularly adept at using was the bow and arrow, and it was the recurved bow. So essentially it was made of strips of wood and sometimes bone glued together, and it was short because you can't use a long bow on a horse. And it was recurved like that, and to string it you had to bend it round and string it like that. So it was incredibly tense. There's a lot of tension in it, and a lot of power when you pull the string back. If you didn't know how to actually string a bow, there is a Scythian actually doing it. A wonderful image of a man using his, there's the bow, see between his legs, he's using the legs to tense the bow apart and one hand to hook the bowstring over the end. Beautiful illustration, typical Scythian pointed hat and so on. There is a Scythian on a coin actually using his bow, his recurved bow, and you see here what is called a goritus, which is the thing that he had his bow and his arrows in. And here's one not all that clear, but sort of squatting down lounging on a seat, and there is the goritus there with the bow and the arrows. So lots of wonderful detail of this vital element of Scythian society. There are the arrowheads. You can see beautifully designed to be very effective, because if you got one of those stuck in you and tried to pull it out, that little hook would rip your wound apart. So they were very effective weapons. And Herodotus says that beware of them because they're nearly always poisoned. And he does a sort of do-it-yourself account of how you make poison for an arrow. You get a load of blood from an animal and a big cauldron of blood, and you get the venom from female snakes that are about to give birth because it's much more powerful. And you put the venom in the blood and then you leave it to ferment and grow, or whatever it does, for several weeks, and then you take it out and smear it on your arrows, and you be sure to keep well clear of those arrows. So again, the whole picture, from the images, from the archaeology, from the descriptions, able to put that picture together. That little bowl, flask, is from Kol Olba in just north of the Black Sea. And we look at it again here. There's the scene we've seen. Here are the other scenes. And again, wonderful scenes. Two Scythians, one binding the leg of another. Two Scythians talking, exchanging information with shields. That one's got his goritus, you see the arrows there. There's the shield, the spears. And here, one possibly dealing with the tooth, aching tooth of another. This is the most amazing vessel. And what it reminds us is of brotherhood, blood brotherhood. These are pairs of people working together, caring for each other. And that's something that, again, Herodotus talks about, how you have blood brothers and you have some wine or something in a flask, and you and your blood brother cut your wrists and bleed into it, and then you both drink the drink. And here is actually a scene of that going on. Two people drinking from the similar cup, same cup, and establishing their brotherhood there. So a little bit of the sort of social structure of the Scythians coming over in these images. And there's one someone made earlier. It comes from a museum exhibition in Kiev, I think it is. Yeah, the sort of guy you wouldn't want to meet in Walton Street on a dark night. But you see, with his goritas there, with the bow in, and the arrows there, spear, the short dagger by the side. This one is wearing iron scale armour and armoured helmet, and he's carrying his shield on his back. Shield probably made of timber, sticks, held together with leather. And here this wonderful scene from a comb showing people battling. It probably is an actual historical event, which we know about. And well, people have argued that it is an historical event, where a conflict between named people. But this guy on the horse, wearing his scale armour, he's actually got a Greek helmet on. He's a Scythian, but he's wearing a Greek helmet. So they were borrowing things from the Greeks. And the chap he's fighting has got one of these shields made of staves of wood, bound together, light and flexible. And this is, his horse has been killed and it's single combat, and here is this guy's supporter going in, again with his shield and short sword. So a conflict scene. And then after the battle, you collect the heads of your enemies that you've killed. And this is a little bit of a helmet showing someone with a head of an enemy. I like the way he's sort of carrying it to one side so it doesn't drip on his legs. Again, Herodotus tells us about this. It was a sensible thing to do if your status was measured by the number of people you'd managed to kill in battle and so on. Well, that's one of the elements of it. And you had to demonstrate how many people you'd killed in battle. So the easiest way to do it was cut off their heads and stack them around you. And then there was a reckoning at the end of the battle. So you took all your heads and they were counted and you were rewarded accordingly. And then what you did, you didn't want all these heads, but you wanted some symbol of them. So you scalped them. And Herodotus again gives us a very good idea of how you scalp a head. You sort of take a knife and you cut all the way around the outside, and you grab hold of the hair and you give it a good shake and the head falls out, and there you've got the scalp in your hand. And what they did with the scalps was to put them on their horses, on the fronts of their horses, on the bridles of the horses and so on. And if they got too many, they made cloaks of them. So if you had a cloak made of scalps, you were a pretty impressive person. So this is the kind of warrior society we're talking about. Not perhaps to our taste these days, but these are people living at a different time and a different place to a whole series of different standards. And our job as archaeologists and anthropologists is to observe them and study them and try to understand them, not to be critical. Now, let's just move to another aspect, a slightly more peaceful aspect of life. We're going back here into the Altai mountains, and this is a famous site of Pazyryk, which was a burial ground in the Altai mountains. This is in southern Siberia, and it was excavated in before the Second World War, in the 1930s, basically. And what they found were a number of burials which were pits dug into the ground and burial tombs created with timbers. There's one in plan. And then they were covered over by a mound of stone. And there is one of the mounds of stone still showing, giving you some idea of the size. The important thing about this is that it's in an area where the ground freezes. And therefore, in winter, the ground freezes to several meters in depth. And in the summer, it thaws out again. But if you put a great mound of stones over, it doesn't thaw out under that mound of stones. It stays as permafrost. It doesn't thaw. And that means that all the organic materials buried in your tombs under these mounds of stone are brilliantly preserved. Preservation that you just do not get hardly get in other archaeological contexts. So that's why these tombs are so important. It's why there is a real problem now because with climate change, this permafrost is just thawing, and these sites that haven't been excavated, all the organic material which has been preserved for 2,000 years, will start to decay very quickly. So there is a real problem for the Russian archaeologists. What is preserved is everything, including the skin of the bodies. And here are a couple of archive photographs from that excavation with one of the bodies in position, skin still there, feet poking out of the cold water. And here a detail of one showing that the body has been cut open and sewn up again. And Herodotus tells us again about this, what they do when people die, important people, they cut them open, take the entrails out, sometimes take some muscle tissue out and stuff the bodies with organic grasses and herbs and things like that, sweet-smelling stuff, and then sew them up again. And that is, so Herodotus says, so that they can take them from one place, the bodies, from one place to another place, to another place, to another place, to show that the king or the lord has died. Very important. You know, it's like King or Queen of England lying in state for people to know that they've died. So, so you cart these bodies around and show them, and everywhere you stop, people come and see, and there is a feast and so on. It's part of the social system. I think there's probably another reason why you do it in the Altai mountains, because if grandfather dies midwinter, the ground is so hard you can't dig a grave. So the body has got to sort of hang around a bit. So there's a good reason for taking the entrails out and keeping them so they are better preserved before the ground is soft enough to dig to bury. But this gives us a huge amount of information about people, and the ancient DNA of all this has not yet been approached, and it is a huge source of good evidence. The bodies, again, it shows us a lot more than we can get from normal archaeology. The bodies were tattooed, tattooed all over. I mean, this is, it's only the well-preserved bits where the tattooing shows. Some of the rest of the bits weren't well preserved. You see a complete arm, probably covered in tattoo. And if you saw someone like that, you would be able to read them. You would know that they would be telling you about their beliefs and their lineages and their family histories and so on, all in that tattoo. And here is, in fact, that chap's arm, the skin of the arm, which you can still see in the museum in St. Petersburg. And you see the quality of the tattooing is stunning. Here is, in fact, a beast, a deer with its antlers, and there is its body bent back with its back legs there and its front legs there. Wonderful depictions. So one can imagine that at least this particular group, and probably most of them, were tattooed and were carrying their art styles and their beliefs around with them. And that's a way for art styles to spread very rapidly if people spread. And they're tattooed, so the art styles spread. Also in these tombs we have their clothing. This is a mantle made of skins of small animals, martins and things like that, sewn together. And here this remarkable shoe. We're looking at the sole of the shoe here, all inset with bits of marcasite stone. And you think, well, why on earth? You can't walk on that. But it's a reminder that these are indoor shoes, and indoors you are squatting normally, and what shows is the soles of your feet. So you decorate the soles of your shoes because that's part of your body, as it were, that is being displayed to your neighbours. But it gives an idea of the quality of the craft. And then things like this, one could go on forever, but these are saddlecloths made of felt, dyed in different colours with applique animals sewn on, and a bridle here made largely, or a little bit of bronze, but of leather, all covered in this beautiful carved wood with animal art. Again, fearsome beasts. So every aspect of life and body and home was brightly coloured and ornate and full of symbolism. The whole history of the people was captured in that. Herodotus tells us that in the area that he knew, that people were, the kings were carted around, and then when they were dead, and after the party at each stop, then they would stop in the land of the tombs. They would dig a deep shaft. Here is a deep shaft at a place called Cunliffe, and then they would tunnel out from that shaft in making chambers and rooms off, and lay the dead person and all his companions who had been killed for the occasion around. And in this particular case, his horses were in separate shafts with the grooms who had been killed and buried with the horses. And then Herodotus says they build up a huge mound as big as they possibly can. And there is the mound at Cunliffe, a drawing of it. And here is the mound at Solochka, with a Russian excavation in progress. And you can see the sort of size of these mounds, massive, the amount of effort put into them. And what is interesting is that they are made not just of anything you could dig up and pile up. They're made only of turf. So you had to de-turf hectares around and bring the turfs in. And in that mound alone, the archaeologists estimate that there are 1 million turfs. So imagine the effort of cutting that turf and moving it and building it. And people say, well, why just turf? And the suggestion is that just possibly, it is to give the dead person the pasture land that he takes with him to the other world. To say, this pasture, these hectares of pasture here piled over you are yours for eternity. It's a nice idea. They existed, they moved across the steppe, and the last we see of them is the last group lived up here when the Romans occupied most of Europe. The last group lived up here. They were called Alans, but they were still Scythian-type nomads. And then the Huns moved in from the east, totally different kind of people. And the blue is the Huns, with Attila the Hun, moving down into the land of the Alans, and then moving down into Anatolia and into Europe, and helping to bring about the end of the Roman Empire. And mixed up in all that were the last groups of Scythians, these Alans, and they joined in the migratory movements with Germans. And the last we hear of the Alans is they actually end up near Lisbon. So that they've made the complete, their ancestors made the complete migration across Eurasia. And they of course, are just disappear from history. But the last remnants of the Alans come down here into the Caucasus and into what is now Ossetia. And they were known, they were still called Alans in the 14th century there. And the language that is spoken there and the literature that it survives, the oral literature that survives, is the last real remnant we've got of these steppe people. So we start them about 1000 BC, 900 BC, we end them in the 4th century AD. But their art just persists, and the stories of them persist. And if you really want to get into this, reading Herodotus, you can't do better. His description is fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you.